Good afternoon. Everyone ready? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Gulluni, the Hampden District Attorney on Genesee Street in the city of Springfield. Massachusetts law directs that district attorneys control all death investigations within their jurisdictions. All deaths are unquestionably tragic, and few have more impact and draw more scrutiny than when police officers are involved in those deaths. As in this case, and with any homicide, we must remember and respect that there is a family grieving for a loved one whose life was taken suddenly and traumatically. When these circumstances arise, we district attorneys, as elected leaders, bear the responsibility of investigating and determining if the use of force leading to one's death was appropriate and lawful. All death investigations, especially those involving an officer's use of deadly force, must be investigated openly, transparently, and objectively. And the process by which this investigation is conducted must be methodical, thorough, and consistent. This process and the consistency and transparency that must be its hallmarks is first about a fair and just outcome. But second, it's about building trust in law enforcement in all communities. Incidents like this one have sparked unrest and distrust for police across our country. It is incumbent on us, on me, to ensure that this incident does not deter or erode a positive relationship between law enforcement and the community that we serve, which is a critical component to a safe and united community. In fact, it's an occasion in all its dimensions. And when a police officer exercises good training, skill, and judgment, we have as much responsibility to prove that as we do when the opposite occurs. None of this will happen with knee-jerk reactions or piecemeal conclusions. This is why my office and I have followed a nationally recognized and proven model that focuses on consistency in our investigation. On January 10, a letter went to the Springfield Police Department to the attention of the captain of the Springfield Police Major Crimes Unit, asking for all materials and evidence to be provided immediately to my office. This included body-worn camera footage, Ring doorbell video footage, additional video from a private residence on Cash Street, witness and victim statements, use of force statements, first responder reports, crime scene reports and photos, 911 call and dispatch logs, shot spotter reports, and the Springfield Police Department's electronic control weapons policy. Additionally, we sought and received an expedited autopsy report from the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner and its accompanying toxicology report. I also sought and received an expedited ballistics report from the Firearms Identification Section of the Massachusetts State Police. At the appropriate times, my office has been in contact with Mr. Taylor's family, who was afforded the opportunity to come to the office and view the videos. Other community leaders were also engaged and informed of the office's protocol, its likely timeline, and the nature of the investigation. Over the past week and a half, my foremost goal has been to maintain the integrity. It is my responsibility to ensure that this office acts independently and with unequivocal integrity. The involved parties and the public deserve and rightfully expect a district attorney's office that makes its decision based on facts, the goal, and one that I believe that we have reached here today. On January 9th, 2022, a named male victim called 911 approximately 9:30 in the morning. He provided a detailed description of this assailant. Officers Argel Falcone and Christopher Roberts were dispatched to the scene and on the lookout for a male dressed in black Converse Chuck Taylor sneakers, black pants, black pea coat with a black mask. Call recordings show the caller did not know the identity of the suspect. Officers only had the description that was given. At about 8:45 a.m., officers Falcone and Roberts notified dispatch that they had a possible suspect matching the description in the area of 110 Franklin Street. Officers noted that as soon as Mr. Taylor saw the cruiser, he turned and began walking in the opposite direction. Based on the information that they had been provided and their own observations of Mr. Taylor, they had ample reasonable suspicion to perform a lawful investigative stop. Officer Roberts pulled the cruiser up next to Mr. Taylor on Franklin Street, and both officers exited the cruiser. Mr. Roberts stated that Mr. Taylor began moving away from officers, while keeping his right hand in his pocket. Body-worn camera footage from Officer Roberts and ring camera footage both recorded Officer Roberts loudly and clearly ordering Mr. Taylor to stop and, quote, drop it multiple times as soon as he exits the cruiser. Body-worn camera footage shows Mr. Taylor moving away from police as both officers shouted him, quote, drop it. As Officer Roberts chases me his bare hands, Officer Falcone had not unholstered any weapons at that juncture. Officer Roberts' body-worn camera then shows Mr. Taylor lunge and thrust with a sharp object in his right hand into the face and neck area of Officer Falcone, thereby stabbing him. The stab wound causes Officer Falcone to fall to the ground as he bleeds from the wound. Officer Roberts' body-worn camera and ring camera footage both show that after the stabbing of Officer Falcone, Mr. Taylor turns back towards Officer Roberts and briefly brandishes the knife in his right hand. Officer Roberts backs up until Mr. Taylor begins running around the corner onto Genesee Street. Officer Roberts then runs past his partner, Officer Falcone, and asks if he is okay. Officer Falcone responded, quote, yo, I just got stabbed in the face. Officer Falcone gets back on his feet with his gun drawn. Officer Roberts continues to pursue Mr. Taylor as he runs past 92 Genesee Street towards the Liberty Street intersection. As Mr. Taylor nears the intersection, he turns around and begins approaching officers who are now in front of 92 Genesee Street. At this point, both officers had drawn their department-issued firearms and pointed them at Mr. Taylor. Both officers walked closest to 92 Genesee Street. He then crossed the street in a diagonal fashion while still moving in the direction of officers. As he does this, body-worn camera and the ring video both show Officers Falcone and Roberts backpedaling with their guns drawn as they attempt to maintain physical distance from Mr. Taylor. Throughout this encounter, officers clearly and continuously order Mr. Taylor to drop the weapon. In the view of the various cameras, it is also apparent that both officers attempted to keep distance from Mr. Taylor when he faces them and ultimately charged at Officer Falcone. As Mr. Taylor charged, he raised his right hand to head level in a manner consistent with preparing for a downward stabbing motion as he runs directly towards Officer Falcone. Officer Falcone showed Mr. Taylor to be approximately 6 feet away from Officer Falcone when the shots are fired. Body-worn camera from Officer Roberts and ring video show that Officer Falcone was still backpedaling as he fired the shots at Mr. Taylor as Mr. Taylor charged toward him in close distance rapidly on the officer. At this point, I want to warn you, we're going to show a portion of the videos that is graphic and may be disturbing to some viewers. Jason?
Recording. Drop it! Drop it! Drop it! Drop it! Oh! You alright? You alright, Steph? Start us another car. Running towards Liberty. Start a 7. Drop the fucking weapon! Drop the weapon! Drop it! 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 Shots fired! Shots fired!
It is this office's opinion that Officer Falcone's use of deadly force was reasonable and unavoidable in the interest of his own safety, that of his partners, and that of the public's. Upon the officers' arrival to the scene, they were presented with a man suspected of a nearby attempted stabbing. Officer Falcone did not confront the suspect with any weapons, but rather attempted to grab him with bare hands. Mr. Taylor almost immediately exercised lethal force in the form of a knife against Officer Falcone, stabbing him in the face. After being seriously assaulted, Officer Falcone and his partner pursued the fleeing suspect with firearms drawn. Mr. Taylor then, of his own accord, stopped running, turned towards officers, raised the knife in his hand, and charged. Officers Falcone and Roberts nevertheless still attempted to maintain physical separation from Mr. Taylor and rely on verbal commands in avoiding the application of lethal force. Mr. Taylor ignored these commands and charged rapidly and directly at Officer Falcone with the knife in a position to inflict serious injury or death. In fact, it was the actions of Mr. Taylor that dictated the reasonable and necessary use of lethal force by Officer Falcone. He fired 2 shots and ceased firing when the threat was neutralized. The entirety of the amassed, uncontroverted evidence all stand clearly in agreement that Officer Argel Falcone's use of deadly force was his unavoidable last resort, to which he arrived after having suffered serious injury, issuing repeated verbal commands, and backpedaling to furnish Mr. Taylor with further opportunities to acquiesce. The death of Orlando Taylor III is a profound tragedy. Yet, the role of this office is to find and consider the facts, as established by the undisputed evidence, and apply the relevant law. My report finds that Officer Falcone acted dutifully and in accordance with appropriate standards and training. His decision to fire his weapon twice at Mr. Taylor under the foregoing circumstances constituted a lawful and reasonable exercise of self-defense and defense of others pursuant to the law. Accordingly, criminal charges are not warranted, and this investigation is considered closed. In the interest of complete transparency for the public and everyone involved, all evidence with only limited and necessary redactions will be made available to the media and to the public in the interest, again, of complete transparency.
The use of less than lethal force, such as a taser?
In my legal opinion, as it's expressed in the memo, based on the standards and training which I adopt as reasonable of the Springfield Police Department, it was appropriate for officers at that point, once lethal force had been applied by Mr. Taylor in the form of the stabbing, that they had the right, and really, frankly, it was necessary for them to respond with their own deadly force. And given the obvious facts as shown in the video, the charging individual towards them who had already exhibited his ability and willingness to use lethal force, Officer Falcone's drawing of his firearm and use of his firearm in the form of lethal force was appropriate and at least arguably necessary.
Was this the same footage that was shown to the Taylor family last week?
Taylor family was shown all the videos. Yeah, this is a portion of the 3 videos, the 3 primary videos. They were shown everything. I provided them with my report and the materials and told them my conclusions. Continued, as I have already, to express my condolences and sympathy to their family, and did my best to provide this in the most compassionate way possible.
What was their response?
There were several members of the family. The response was generally understanding. There was some questions and some disagreement expressed, but it was, I guess amicable is not the right word, Stephanie, but it was a productive discussion and a respectful discussion, and we ended with handshakes. Doug?
I mean, the build-up to this, the family have been saying, I believe that to yourself, and they've been saying in public that Orlando had a history of mental health issues. They were looking to get help. Is there anything that your office can or is doing
Doug, it's a great question, and it's one I think that calls on larger circumstances than what was my job here today. You know, I think it's clear, and I know the family has expressed that Mr. Taylor had been dealing with mental health issues. And I think on the day of this incident, he was in the throes of a crisis. My job was to analyze the facts, apply the law, and make a decision as to whether there were criminal charges, and clearly my decision is no. Speaking outside of that role, I think clearly as a society we have to do a better job with mental health. And probably more particularly as a criminal justice system, we have to do a better job with mental health, because it drives a lot of the work that we do, and it drives and is a part of tragedies like this. But that cannot be faulted upon the police officers or Officer Falcone. In this scenario, they were presented with a very dangerous situation and injury, and they acted in accordance with the law and in accordance with their training. So a larger discussion might be appropriate on the issue of mental health and the gaps in the system. And I know the family has spoken to that. I've spoken to them about that. And I'm hopeful that those gaps are closed, that our work improves, and that we never have another tragedy of these circumstances again.
Is there an update on Officer Falcone since the last trip?
I'm not going to provide that. I'll leave that either to his employer or to himself. That's not my position to speak. I understand he is out of the hospital and recovering, but it was a very serious incident. But any updates I'll leave to folks closer to him.
There's been some information supplied from the police department about Officer Falcone's record and accommodations that he received. Did you examine his complete record? Was there any?
No, it's irrelevant to me.
Irrelevant to this? There's also been some commentary, as I know you're aware, about the press conference that the police commissioner and the mayor had roughly 4.5 hours after the shooting happened. Should they have announced at that time that their conclusion that this was justified, or should they have waited for you?
No, they shouldn't have. But my job was unchanged, and my job is to examine the facts, collect the evidence, and make a decision pursuant to the law. So it really has no bearing on the job that I had to do. I did my best to be transparent and communicative with the public, as we will going forward, providing all the evidence, and draw a conclusion that I hope the public understands and accepts. But you know, what other officials did really doesn't have a bearing on my job.
Speaking of other officials, D.A., did this whole scenario erode your relationships with the PD or City Hall?
Yeah, it's not for me to comment about right now. And I have a job to do as the chief law enforcement officer in this county, and we work with police departments. I work with other elected officials, and that will continue. You know, my focus in the last 11 days was on completing this investigation as quickly as possible and doing it objectively and fairly and coming to sound legal conclusions.
Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you.